It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Sana Saboowala. Sana is a PhD candidate at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign in the Evolution, Ecology, and Conservation Biology program. Sana works at the Malhi Molecular Anthropology Lab, where she studies how lived experiences are embodied. Currently, she focuses on how historical trauma from the 1947 partition impacts South Asian immigrants to the United States through a combination of anti-colonial feminist science studies, oral history, and epigenetics. More broadly, she aims to take a multidisciplinary approach to research, drawing on the humanities to answer scientific questions more deeply. And please help me welcoming Sana. And Sana, you can go ahead and begin.
Great, thanks, Andy. It's great to be here talking to all of y'all today. As Andy said, I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, and today I'll talk about my work in progress on my dissertation exploring biological embodiment in South Asian immigrants to the United States. I want to start with by recognizing and acknowledging that I did most of this work on the lands of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Piankashaw, Wea, Miami, Mascoutin, Ottawa, Sauk, Muskogee, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations. I'm currently visiting family on Cheyenne land in Colorado. These lands were the traditional territory of these native nations prior to their forced removal. These lands continue to carry the stories of these nations and their struggles for survival and identity. Sorry if there's background noise. Hopefully it's not too distracting. I also wanted to mention that the systems of power that perpetuate the colonial ideas and allow settler colonialism to continue are all connected. Thus, efforts to restore Indigenous lands to its rightful stewards, protect the environment, and support the right to self-determination and prevent genocide are all connected. My project looks at how colonial powers shaped South Asia today, but they do not take on-the-ground action against violent systems. Here are some organizations that do. I'm happy to share these links in the chat or via email with anybody who's interested. So my work focuses on embodiment, which can be defined as the process of a person or group incorporating, internalizing, and reproducing the material and socio-cultural world around them. This definition obviously comes from sociocultural anthropology. In bioanth and public health, we tend to use this 2005 definition, a concept referring to how we literally incorporate biologically the material and social world in which we live from in utero to death. I take an interdisciplinary approach to understanding embodiment with a specific focus on how intergenerational memory and migration-related stress may impact epigenetic biomarkers in South Asian immigrants to the United States. Often when we look at embodiment, we think about it in this kind of linear way, where an environment or lived experience is somehow affecting the biology and we're measuring it through a biomarker or phenotype. We've made a lot of progress in studying embodiment, especially in kind of unpacking this black box of mediating biological mechanisms. But this unidirectional framing, although it can be really useful to like kind of simplify a complex concept, can also lead to harm, especially with kind of deterministic frameworks that in which an environment can be seen to always lead to a specific biomarker or phenotype. And that's like an environmentally deterministic perspective that is reductive. And to kind of combat that, my colleagues and I invite you to think about embodiment as multidirectional. And so this is drawing from Michael Rothbard's work on multidirectional memory, where he asks us to consider memory as multidirectional, as subject to ongoing negotiation, cross-referencing, and borrowing as productive and not privative. Embodiment, the relationship between the environment, the perception of lived experiences, and then the biomarkers we measure are equally entangled. The body, the experience, and the environment are interrelated and in flux. This is a dynamic process that's constantly subject to similar negotiation, cross-referencing, and borrowing from internal and external signals. So even as I move on to talk about kind of the specific mechanisms of embodiment that I'm interested in studying, keep in mind that embodiment is this dynamic process, and what we can look at is just a snapshot in time. So I'm particularly interested in gene expression and epigenetics. So when I'm talking about epigenetics, I'm referring to usually chemical markers that affect how much protein a gene produces. So you have your genotype, which is your DNA sequence, and that doesn't really change. And then you have your epigenome, which are chemical markers that are on top of that DNA sequence that affect how much protein a gene produces. So more than a switch, it works like a dial, where epigenetic marks can kind of turn up or turn down the intensity of gene expression, which produces protein, which makes your phenotype or your physical traits. I'm particularly interested in epigenetics because your epigenome is changeable within your lifetime and affected by the environment, whether that's your physical environment, your socio-cultural, political, or economic environment. These can all potentially affect epigenetic marks, which then affect gene expression. I'm specifically interested in cytosine methylation because there's some evidence that this can change within your lifetime and it might be heritable. So cytosine methylation is when a methyl group is added to a cytosine. I'm specifically looking at CpG methylation, which means, so like if this figure B is a DNA sequence with your base pairs, when a cytosine or a C is next to a G, a guanine in your DNA sequence, we call that a CpG. And I'm interested in when methyl groups are added to cytosines that are next to guanines. This usually what happens when a cytosine is methylated like this is that it prevents transcription factor binding. So it will reduce the expression of the gene. So this gene that is methylated will produce less protein than if it was not methylated. And I'm also particularly interested in stress, right? And methylation and demethylation can affect stress response. And I'm interested in intergenerational memory and migration-related stress. There's some evidence to believe that this could be embodied through stress response methylation. So your stress response is controlled through your HPA axis, which is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. And so basically when you experience stress, this pathway gets activated and usually you produce cortisol and other stress hormones. And the way your body knows your body regulates this so that you stop producing those stress hormones is through this GR-mediated negative feedback mechanism. And when certain life experiences happen that affect methylation, they usually affect methylation at this GR-mediated negative feedback loop. So what happens is because of changes in methylation, this feedback loop doesn't get activated as fast. And so your body is in a state of stress for longer periods of time. And there's been some research on HPA axis dysregulation via methylation and its relation to lived experiences, including childhood maltreatment, harsh punishment, intimate partner violence, and experiences of trauma at a collective level. I'm particularly interested in historical trauma, which can be thought about as historical trauma events and then responses to those historical trauma events. So an event is a historical trauma event if many of the members of a community experienced the event, it generated a high level of collective distress, and the event is perpetrated with purposeful destructive intent, usually by outsiders. Some examples that have commonly studied historical trauma events are the Holocaust and settler colonialism. And then the responses to these events include the event continuing to undermine the well-being of group members. The response to the event interacts with contemporary stressors, and associated risks accumulate across generations. And kind of elsewhere in my work, I talk about post-memory, Marianne Hirsch's concept of post-memory as a response to historical trauma. And I'm particularly interested in historical trauma stemming from partition in South Asia. And I just want to put out like a content warning here that in the next few slides, I'll talk briefly about sexual assault. So please take care of yourself however you need to. Partition, here I refer to the 1947 colonial border creation event that divided the Indian subcontinent into India and Pakistan. This border creation displaced upwards of 14 million people. It was one of the largest refugee crises of the 20th century. And the upheaval also sparked extreme communal violence between religious communities and mass rape. Communalism, which is the violence between religious communities when we talk about it in South Asia, science and eugenics are all connected. And it's really important to think about, as a scientist working on partition, thinking about how these things are interconnected and continue to impact society today are really important. Knowing this context is vital for doing any kind of research. And we really need to think about what science is for before we engage in it. And like considering this kind of context is a form of harm reduction in science, in my opinion. And the reason it's hard sometimes to think about this context in science is because science has become, or has been since inception, really depoliticized. So when we think about science, generally we're talking about science stemming from Enlightenment frameworks of the Age of Reason, where like certain members of society decided what the processes were that allow us to come to an objective truth, right? And often historically what we see in science is that objectivity is a stand-in for like rich Protestant white cis heteropatriarchal perspective, right? That is what gets counted as objective truth because those are the people who are deciding what makes science, right? And around this time in like the 1800s, we also see a increasing interest in boundaries and classification. I'm sure many of you know about Linnaeus and the biological taxonomy. We sometimes forget that this was a hierarchical exercise in which humans were also classified and ranked. And these ideas really justified a lot of divide and conquer policies in the colonial context. In South Asia specifically, colonial science or the advent of Western science really formalized divisions that already existed in South Asian society. So they really like built up on divisions on the pre-existing caste system, which, side note, congratulations on the UC system for adding caste protections as part of their discrimination policy recently. But these existing divisions existed in society for thousands of years, but colonial science created a system to formalize these. Also, post-1857 rebellion in India, you see an increase in divisions based on martial race theory. So the idea that certain members of certain ethnic groups were more well-suited to being in the British military than others. This was mainly a way to prevent certain ethnic groups, especially Bengalis who were involved in the 1857 uprising from gaining power, but is couched in essentialist ideas about certain ethnic groups being too effeminate, too weak, and other ethnic groups being stronger and also more easily controllable. It also built on Islamophobia stemming from the Crusades and formalized kind of essentialist ideas that had persisted in British society for centuries. Also, science, these essentialist ideas that were then like given the backing of science to make it seem objective, right? Justified British rule. There was, ideas of the great chain of being and white supremacy were considered objective truths, and communalism especially was seen as something natural and innate to South Asian people and Muslims, Hindus, and Sikhs. So the British use this to justify British rule and kind of take the paternalistic argument that South Asians need British rule, otherwise they would descend into chaos. With partition, especially, the concepts of purity, reproduction, and inheritance, which are biological concepts in that they are considered innate, contributed to and solidified, and were solidified through communal violence during partition. And the nature of eugenic ideas surrounding purity, reproduction, and inheritance are gendered at their core. The ideology which values these things objectifies women into a vehicle for reproduction, or give women value through the concept of a womb. This conceptualization is not unique to the Indian subcontinent or partition. However, the rampant gendered and sexual violence during partition left indelible scars on the subcontinent. The fear of rape and gendered violence was a major motivator for migration. And the linking of honor at multiple scales with women's purity, especially the link between a woman's purity and a man's masculinity, led to unspeakable violence. The use of rape and sexual mutilation, including the amputation of breasts, tattooing, and branding, marked women as desecrated and conquered. And biology in service of nationalism plays up these ideas of purity and inheritance. These ideas justified the use of rape as a weapon of national communal violence, as reproduction was valued and community honor was seen to rest in a woman's sexual purity. Religious identity and community belonging are ideologically linked to inheritance and therefore genetics, as genetics is defined as the study of heredity. In the Indian subcontinent in 1947 and even today, religion, a stand-in for community belonging, is seen as an inherited characteristic. In our cis-heteropatriarchal society, women possess the womb, and therefore the purity of their wombs allow the community to persist. And this eugenic logic continues to fuel ideas of endogamy, honor killing, and myths of love jihad. So the biological language that was, like really popularized during colonial era, fueled a lot of violence during partition, and that the scars of those violence are continuing to impact Indian society today. Elsewhere in my work, I go into detail about how this communalism combined with science and bureaucratic technology fosters communal division and created the world order we see today, with derogatory myths about Muslims being spread and contributing to eugenics in India today. And how the diaspora is connected to this through organizing and money as well. And I also talk about the ways information about violent incidences is communicated both officially and unofficially, and this fuels rumors and cyclical violence. And the idea that communal violence often occurred because of rumors is discussed in this book, Remembering Partition. And I'll be exploring that idea further along with oral histories kind of later in my work. And all of this context is really necessary as it sets up the way personal life history is interconnected to these larger narratives. You can't separate the life story from the individual narrative, obviously, but neither can you separate it from the collective spaces of family, community, and nation. Memory studies scholar Hallbox talks about how individual memory is a product of collective memory, which is produced by place. So migration, a change of place, impacts memory at multiple scales because of this interconnectedness. And so, I'm working specifically with migrants, and being a migrant, as well as being a child of a migrant, is part of the social context, collective memory, and family history that you can't separate from the individual narrative. And so this is, again, like understanding how the collective is related to the individual while the individual remains unique is necessary to get a sense of the kind of entanglement that exists in reality. We need to look at the collective to understand the individual, and that's a reflection of the multidirectionality of these questions. And to try to get at that, right? Like to try to really study this, I use oral histories. So I use the oral history, the life history format. I ask people, sorry, let me back up. So I conducted oral histories with the 1947 Partition Archive, which is an organization devoted to collecting oral histories from people who were alive during the 1947 partition. And their oral history format starts off with, memories of childhood memories where people were born, their lives before partition. Then there's a set of questions about during partition, and then their life after. And I follow the same format when I do oral histories with the children of partition witnesses who immigrated to the United States. So I ask them questions about their parents' memories. I ask them questions about their childhood and growing up. I ask them questions related to immigration, and then I ask them questions about their life after immigration. And oral histories are valuable for their subjectivity. We're not we know that the oral history is a reflection of the individual narrative, and the collective narrative, family, community, and national. They're not meant to be quote unquote objective histories. They're supposed to be personal stories. And so they provide a space for participants to express their own lived experiences and tell us in their own words which lived experiences are important to them. And it provides lived experience in context. And I use a combination of narrative analysis and frenetic iterative approach to analyzing these oral histories. And some of the themes that have come about, so I looked at 25 oral histories with people who are alive during partition, and so far I've done 11 with people whose parents were alive during partition and then they moved to America. And some of the rumors that are coming up across all of these interviews are the impact of rumors, ideas of migration and rootlessness. And I would like to further that and think about adaptability and acceptance of change. Another major theme is social networks. And then related to stress specifically, people talk about grief and uncertainty as being particularly stressful life experiences. I also asked participants to fill out a survey to get some quantifiable variables, right? Because the way our systems are set up now to understand if there is differential methylation, I need to have some quantifiable variables. So some things I ask about on the survey are general well-being, medical history, experiences of trauma, and perceived discrimination. And all of these end up being, medical history is categorical, but the rest of them end up being quantified in some way. And something I'm struggling a lot with in my work right now is kind of thinking about the ethics of surveying trauma, especially in conjunction with the oral histories. Does it make sense to be quantifying experiences of trauma, or binarizing things like experiences of grief? Is this really helping us understand what's really happening, or is it just easier to standardize, so we do it this way? So that's kind of something that I'm a roadblock in my work that I'm really thinking about these days. But I am interested in, is embodiment through methylation happening? The hypothesis I'm testing is this idea that people whose parents migrated due to partition will have differential methylation as stress-related genes than people whose parents did not, because of the potential heritable effects of cytosine methylation. I'm also interested in kind of doing some ad hoc testing apart from my main hypothesis. I think that maybe there could be differences in methylation due to experiences of trauma, also differences in methylation based on, people who express a lot of gratitude in telling their life story versus people who don't, and also people who talk about strong social networks. I'm also interested in the conserved transcriptional response to adversity. So this is a gene expression profile that's shows like an upregulation of pro-inflammatory genes and a downregulation of antiviral genes. So, and this pattern of more inflammation and less antiviral protection is linked to negative clinical outcomes. And it's a pattern that we see across species when they are exposed to adversity. In humans, we've done studies ranging from adversity ranging from having a low socioeconomic status all the way to experiencing combat as a child soldier. And we're seeing this pattern. I'm hoping to measure CTRA in a variety of ways. One of them is called ITACT, which is this ratio that is, you can see on the screen, where you have the cells related to immune function over the cells related to antiviral function. And the bigger that ratio is, the more likely you are to have a CTRA profile, right? You can also measure this. There's 53 genes that have been marked as the gold standard to measure this. So you can measure this through gene expression or RNA sequencing as well. So I'm interested in looking at the looking at how concordant these measures are, the ITAC score and the transcript level. And I'm also interested in if there's any patterns in CTRA among my participants. So kind of just an overview of what I've talked about. I'm really trying to take an interdisciplinary approach to embodiment. I think science has historically been a tool for imperialism, and I want to think about alternative ways to be looking at a lot of these scientific concepts. To that end, I use oral histories to understand subjective lived experience, with an understanding that the individual story relies on narratives at multiple collective scales. And gene expression may be impacted by these lived experiences. And those lived experiences, they are individualized, but they are also reflective of the collective at a lot of these scales. Yeah, so that's all I'd like to acknowledge the Malhi Molecular Anthropology Lab, my committee members, the 1947 Partition Archive, and the participants of this project for their help with this work. Also my funders, the National Science Foundation, UIUC's PEAK program, and the Mellon Mays Graduate Initiative program. And yeah, that's all I have. Any questions? Thank you.
All right. Thanks so much, Sana. We really, really appreciate it. Really wonderful research. I just wanted to open the floor for questions. We had a couple of questions come in. One by Delaney Glass. Delaney says, I really appreciate the nuances you have raised about stress research. As a fellow stress migration displacement researcher, I'm curious about how you think about HPA axis dysregulation. This is a term that's used a lot, but rarely defined or arbitrarily defined. How do you think about dysregulation? What are the implications of that in the context you're working in?
Yeah, I was struggling even using that term in this presentation as well, because it's really hard when looking at these biological mechanisms to not use language that presumes a normal, right? Because even if you have you're experiencing this methylation and your stress response is longer than another person's who's doesn't have this FKBP5 methylation, is that dysregulation, or is it just it's individualized, is regulated to your life experience, right? So I think that's a great point. And I don't know if the way to do it is to not use the term, or maybe you're right, just be really specific in defining the term when you use it. But I think it's it's a really important thing to think about.
Cool. Thanks. We have another question from Sarah Lacey, coming from CSU Dominguez Hills. Did the UC add caste to its discrimination policies? The CSU system did, but it was at the urging of the faculty union, and now there's a pending lawsuit over it. As a campus union co-president, this is very helpful for me to know if anyone knows. I don't know, Sana, I don't know if you know. There might be other people in this call who might know.
Yeah, I saw an article today, maybe I can try to find it, about the CSU system. I had thought that the UC system recently added it to its student like for student protections, but I might be misinformed as well.
The academic Senate approved something in 2020-21 addressing caste discrimination specifically, but I don't know how that's played out into all of the microsites where discrimination is addressed. So it's a really good question.
Yeah. Coming from Professor Lawrence Cohen, also a professor in the Department of Anthropology at UC Berkeley. Okay, other questions that we have, feel free to post in the chat or turn your video. Okay, Malika.
Hi, this is a really fabulous presentation. Thank you. So as someone who has like a personal connection to partition and having family members who have lived through that, I'm just curious, in your interviews, how did you find the intersection between personal recollection and memory and I guess emotion with documentation and documented facts? Because I found in like, at least in my own like personal experience, it has felt like a lot of personal memory does not align with much of what is actually documented. And as biological anthropologists, it's always really interesting to think about how that, you know, discontinuity, how that might have impacts on individual bodies and behavior.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I would really point you in the direction of Guy Pandi's books, Remembering Partition and the Construction of Communalism in Colonial North India, I think. Because in his historiographies, he does that work of like, here's what people say and here's what's documented, and makes a like really challenges again this idea of what objective history is, right? Because when we look at the documentation, we can see a lot of the colonial ideology is what gets put in the like actual record, and what people remember is like not is one, both really influenced by this kind of rumors and like things they have heard but don't really know, and that like really you know you can see that become part of people's stories or narratives about themselves. And then you can see in the official records where there's just like a lot of inaccuracies, and that like that's there in the partition literature, but it goes back like much further, where like, you know, there'll be documentation of communal riots and things like that that just are like don't make sense with the timeline of, like, for instance, there was one in the Construction of Communalism book, he talks about one event that was supposed to be like sparked by Muharram processions, but Muharram is on the lunar calendar, so it changes every year, so it couldn't have been at that time. But like, if you don't know, if you know, if it was written by British people who didn't know this, and it was like beneficial for them to view this labor riot as a communal riot instead. So there are a lot of incidences like that where, you know, the written record isn't accurate, and you can never know if a person's personal memory is accurate. But I think what a person believes about themselves is probably more likely to be embodied, right? Mm. Sorry for that long-winded answer.
No, that's amazing. I really love the problematizing of objective science and like showing how that is functionally impacting bodies in ways that I think that a lot of people are not thinking about. So this is great.
Yeah, thanks so much. Another question from Nerly, PhD candidate at Michigan State. She says, thank you for such a wonderful talk. Congratulations. You brought a very important point regarding the ethics of doing research on topics that may be very sensitive or difficult to talk about. Would you like to share any advice or experiences that helped you navigate ethical issues that arise with your research?
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. I think everybody approaches it differently, especially like for me, I also have, you know, family that was impacted by partition. I have family that's agreed to participate in this project, like be a participant in this project. And like, they're trusting me to interview them about their lives. I feel very grateful for their trust in me. And this is also something, especially when I was working with Partition Archive, for a lot of people, this is the first time they're talking about their partition experiences and can be really re-traumatizing. So having just some awareness of like how to react when someone is experiencing that is useful, like just some grounding exercises or like ability to step back, being really, really quick to like turn off your camera, I think is another, like being really mindful of the fact that like this is really personal and like it's not like it's more important that this person's like mental health is preserved than you get your interview, right? The other thing, like I talked a lot with Partition Archive and my IRB about this because my IRB really wanted me to have a like a psychologist or a mental health professional involved, which like culturally would be like unacceptable. If I asked like, you know, some of my 80-year-old participants to talk to a mental health professional, they would not talk to me. Like they would be very offended. It would be really disrespectful, especially like I'm like, you know, much younger than a lot of the any of the participants who are alive in 1947, right? And so that was also, you know, talking with experts at the 1947 Partition Archive. We've been doing this for a long time, and having them like learning from their experience and then having them help me articulate that to the IRB was really important because like there's a lot of, I think that our like ethics guidelines are for very specific purposes, and like you have to on top of that use the context that you know, like use the context that you're working in to kind of figure out what is actually appropriate. I'm still struggling and working through like, even with the genetic results, like, is it ethical for me to give individualized results back when it like doesn't really tell you anything about your health, but you can make it seem like it does, right? Is it better to give like only aggregated results, even if people want to see their individual results? So there are like a lot of ethical questions that come up, and to be honest, I'm kind of taking it one at a time. I don't know if anybody else has any thoughts on how to approach these things. I'd love to hear.
Yeah. Cool. Other questions that we may have? I'm skirting this on it because it's a big question. And maybe we can have time for this to later in the discussion. Lawrence, you had your hands up?
Sure. First, thank you, Sana, very much. And this is very interesting. And kudos on your talking back to the IRB in the way you did. So I guess I think my question echoes Andy's opening question. I had two. I mean, one of which is I assume it's research in midway, and we're lucky to hear it now. But a sense of findings you have with this big comparison. I'm just really curious what you found. If you could say more. And here's the part that may echo Andy. I'm wrestling with if one is looking at the difference between you know, families who've experienced partition violence and their descendants in the ways that you're comparing, and others, how do you think about all of the other sources of stress and violence, including migration, including social difference, caste, etc., including famine, you know, coterminous and, you know, not unrelated to, including post-partition violence, etc., etc., and given the entangled history of families, is that something that you can take into the research design?
Yeah, I think this is like a very big picture question that I have to think about a lot, right? And I think a lot of it is the fact that we view embodiment as this kind of unidirectional thing. In science, we're really trying to like isolate variables, but that's not real, right? What's real is that, you know, your grandparents moved during partition and your family always talks about it, and you moved to America and you've faced racism here, and like all those things are adding up, and they're not adding up in a 1-to-1 ratio where we can just make tallies and put it into a quantifiable variable. And so that's why I struggle a lot with the surveys, because that's kind of what it does, right? And then like, I don't know that you can isolate any of these lived experiences, which is like not very good in terms of like trying to get my work published in a biological journal. But I think it's just the reality of like life, right? So I hope that with the oral histories, I can kind of delve more into the ways that like, because I do think there is something there with people who hold on a lot, or whose families hold on a lot to the narrative of migration from partition. I think there's something that is like there, like you can feel it when you talk to these people. Whether I can see that in a biological sense, I'm unsure yet. And I definitely don't think that anyone can disentangle that from everything else that happens in their lives. I don't know if that answers your question.
It does, but I mean, it makes me think a little bit about some of Veena Das's work with colleagues, the anthropologist. Particularly some of Das's work, not on partition, which she's also, of course, written on, but on the aftermath of the 1984 anti-Sikh violence in North India in particular, where, for example, in one paper, she's really comparing in East Delhi two neighborhoods, both of Sikhs, but in radically different effects of violence. And she looks really closely at why. So she is trying, I think she would argue that you can make careful comparisons in the way that's central to your work. But the way she does it is by scaling things down from writing about the partition to focusing, for example, on the histories of two blocks in one neighborhood, literally, where you can really closely look at very differential outcomes of violence and try to double down on why that might be. And then to bring in the kind of human biology framework that you bring would be really, really interesting. So I don't know if scaling is one way to get at that question.
Yeah, thank you.
Leah, you had your hand up?
Hi. First of all, can you all hear me? By the way, I was struggling a lot. Okay, great. Thank you so much, Sana, for sharing for this lovely lecture. I had a personal question regarding, because a lot of like your work is similar to like a project that I'm working on over summer. It's like my first research project, so I'm kind of a little bit freaking out. Like I was actually looking at all the stuff I have to do and I was like, oh my God, I don't know how to do this. But I'm basically studying the correlation or relationship basically between life force discrimination and overarching like health, physical and mental health, prevalence, conditions, existence just in general. And obviously I'm doing a lit review right now to basically like narrow it down to decide if I want to go in like one direction or the other, like considering somaticization or like specifically mental health conditions and everything. But something that I'm really having to consider is that I might need to do Zoom interviews just for like people's accessibility needs, personal comfort. And I was wondering if you had experience with like Zoom. I know you were speaking about like Zoom meetings, so like, do you have any pointers for like just being aware of the different, I think the different like, not pros and cons, but the different like elements that come with a Zoom meeting versus like an in-person meeting? Because you were saying that like when people are sharing something vulnerable, like you can turn off your camera, like be quick to make them like more comfortable with doing things like that. So it's just like, I wonder if you have any pointers for like just overall etiquette so I can make my participants feel most comfortable when I'm in person or like Zoom, because I imagine they're a little bit different, but I just want to make sure I'm like doing the right things to make them comfortable. If
Yeah,
you had
that's a
any
great
pointers for that.
question. Yeah.
Thank you.
So the interviews I did with Partition for 1947 Partition Archive were mainly in person. And then COVID made it so that I switched to doing Zoom interviews. And I do think there are like benefits and drawbacks to both. I will say, like, I think Zoom people feel more, especially nowadays, people feel more comfortable, and they can be in their own space. They don't have a stranger in their space. They feel like they can just leave at any time, which in person doesn't have that. But you do lose a little bit of kind of the emotional, and maybe people have gotten better at this because we've been on Zoom so much, but when I first started doing interviews, it was a little bit hard for me to kind of gauge the other person's emotional state or how they felt about continuing, because, and I don't know how you're structuring your interviews. Mine are very semi-structured, very open-ended. I have questions, but I don't ask the same ones every time. It's like very conversational. And so with Zoom, it's like a little bit harder to maintain that conversational air. There's like, especially with some participants, there is like a feeling of like, okay, like next question, done, like 20-minute instead of like, my interviews have ranged from about a half hour to like 3.5 hours.
Wow.
So I think some of it is just getting like used to doing it. Like, I just think like it's iterative. Your interviews will get better over time. And I think the fact that you're already thinking about these issues means you're like probably going to head in the right direction.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, good luck.
Thank you.
All right, we have one question here. I'll get to you. So from Noah, Noah says, "Hi Sana, as a South Asian, I'm Memon Gujarati, whose family has been impacted by migration India to South Africa, more so than partition. Going forward, where do you see partition-related health research and medical care going in the treatment of South Asian individuals and how heart disease and other common physical ailments that affect South Asians who were or whose families were affected by partition?" Great question. Thanks so much for that.
Cool. Yeah. I guess I think in India, medical care, like communalism is the effect of partition that's affecting medical care. So there's a lot of, like right now in India, the conditions are for Muslims are very bad, and that is reflected in health systems. I'm hopefully going to be publishing a paper on that this coming year on the ways myths stemming kind of from colonial ideas about Muslims are affecting the medical treatment of Muslims in India specifically. So there's that kind of effect of health in health because of partition, or like because of the communal violence of partition, right? In terms of like personalized healthcare, I am like hesitant to, I mean, South Asians are an extremely diverse group, right? I don't think that we should be treating based on race like that, but there are like, so in my preliminary results, which because it's like, it's a sample size of like 8 people, it's not very meaningful, but we are seeing some differences in genes related to diabetes, which whether or not I can make any statements about health from my sample size is one question, but almost all of my participants are really curious about heart disease and diabetes specifically. So there's definitely that like narrative and worry among South Asian individuals. So, and I don't know if it's necessarily partition related or like I think there's like work being done in that space to see, is it like environmentally determined, or is it like there's a lot of, some of it is like a little scary. There's a lot of like pharmaceutical research being done in that space. And then there's some more like kind of lifestyle related factors being done in that space. I don't know if it'll be partition specifically, but I think it might be related to stress response. And I'm curious to see. I'll definitely keep you posted on where my results go.
Cool.
I hope that answered your question.
So we have one question from the audience. Mark, gonna come up?
Can you hear me okay?
Oops, sorry. Can we ask?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no problem.
Hello, I'm in person. Thank you for your talk. So I actually wanted to ask you a question about form and representation. You mentioned the sort of thoughts that you're trying to mull over about how it is that you might enumerate violence, trauma, suffering, and the ethics of that, the affordances and limits. And so thinking for a moment, not necessarily about enumeration, what other forms of representation are you thinking about with regards to your research, especially as you're trying to do this transdisciplinary and taking this transdisciplinary approach? And I'm just curious as to other kinds of forms that you're thinking about and the affordances and limits of any of those, or any sort of alchemical ideas that you might be brewing. So,
Yeah, I guess, do you mean in terms of like, instead, like apart from looking at the quantitative, the alternatives to that, I guess?
Right. So, you mentioned it's difficult to not enumerate, but want to publish in a biological research journal.
Yeah.
So, are you thinking of ethnographic sort of literature or writing in a way that maybe deals with arts or other forms of those kinds of representations? I'm just wondering if what are some other kinds of non-enumerating forms that have crossed your mind?
Yeah, for sure. I'm really interested in kind of using these oral histories and personal narratives more to understand health, and really thinking about like, I asked my participants like, how's your health, or how do you feel? And kind of what those responses can tell us about how someone is, like somebody's actual health. And like, I don't like, this is very, I'm just early thinking about these things. I don't know if, when you go to the doctor, they don't ask you, how's your health? They tell you how your health is, right? And so kind of thinking about how affect or like personal narratives about health are can tell you what that can tell you about somebody's body and health as well. So that's kind of the direction I'm hoping to move in. But that's very like baby idea right now in its infant stages.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Cool. Sorry, I interrupted someone's question. Can you give
Hi,
one?
that was me.
Yeah, sure.
No,
Please.
so sorry. I didn't hear you say that. That was somebody from the audience. Apologies for that. Thank you so much for your talk. I am coming from the lens of public health, new to the field of sort of anthropology, but really interested in like social epi, so thinking about how histories and these larger environmental factors affect health. And similar to the question that Noah was asking earlier, I'm just wondering, we kind of group Asians into one, and you kind of mentioned even South Asians. There's huge, broad differences in that, but we kind of think about cardiometabolic risk being really high among South Asians, and I'm just wondering if thinking about partition and how this may affect these high increased risks of cardiometabolic disease. Is there anything out there that's looking at maybe comparing states or geographies that are more closely affected by partition versus kind of maybe South India and other parts of the Indian subcontinent that maybe aren't so directly affected? And if there's any kind of, I don't know, a control or comparison studies being done with differences in these geographies and different histories? I don't know if that question was clear, but
I think that's a great question. I think there might be some work on there out there about the differences in South India and like Punjab. There is definitely some state-based work, especially around Punjab as like a highly affected state in partition. I haven't seen anything about health specifically personally. Maybe I just haven't seen it. Originally, when I first started this project, I was only looking at people who are alive during partition, and that for various reasons fell through. And I was originally planning on, using South Indians who never moved during partition as a control group. There are some problems to that because there are people who moved to South India during partition. But there are also a lot of South Indians who in their like interviews are say things like, oh, I only learned about partition through textbooks. I was never affected by it. But then there are also people in Bombay who say the same thing, right? So that's why I ended up deciding to focus on migration, because a lot of the people who were never displaced from their homes have a really different relationship to partition than people who ended up moving from their homes. But that's also like, I don't know if that, I think a geographic explanation fits more with the literature in terms of cardiovascular disease, right? You maybe know better than I do on that one, but it's very complicated. And I think there's a lot of room for more research in that space.
Thank you.
Cool. And I'm just going to ask the last question, Sana. And I've obviously been following this work for such a long time. It's been really fantastic to see it grow and develop. And we both, along with others, I think on this call, are really interested in thinking about science and the practice of human biology from a more critical anti-colonial, decolonial approach, especially for a lot of some of the stakes that you had mentioned in this talk, right? We know about the limitations of biomedicine and how biomedical violence can perpetuate in many different forms of, forms of racism, classism, misogyny, but also in ways that are still being unraveled right now, especially as we think about, new understandings of the human genome, epigenetics, microbiome, things of that nature, neuroscience. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the importance or like the stakes involved in creating a more critical scientific practice. We see this as something that I think is starting to come up more and more with these conversations around DEI and diversity and whatever. But it's not just about representation. It's not just about trying to include more diverse sample sizes or samples, or talking about different forms of which communities of color are sick or diseased. It's very much a different political practice. And I don't think a lot of people are necessarily aware that, science is very much a political practice. So just based on your experience and sort of motivations, like what do you think are the stakes involved? And just the importance of doing critical scientific research?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think that the events of our global events have shown us that the stakes are super high. Like we as our understandings about health and medicine and also eugenics have been huge. Science is so political now, even as it still tries to maintain this depolitical approach. Science is being politicized by the media and outside actors, as well as it's always been politicized by scientists, is my argument, right? And so the stakes are, human health, which is ultimate, that's a huge stake, right? If we continue to think about there being only one way to be healthy or one right way to live, that's we see that that's not going to function. Our society can't function that way. And I think pushing back on that idea is really necessary to make a world where we are where more of us are healthy and living happy lives, right? And even that idea of what is healthy is something that I don't think science can say on its own as it is now. And so thinking about this in a more critical way, I think would the goal is to improve people's lives, right? I think most of us as researchers go into research with that. When you go into human research to try to make things better, right? I maybe that's naive, but I hope so. And so, yeah, I do think obviously if things continue the way they are, it doesn't seem sustainable in the long term for a future that most of us want.
Yeah, no, totally, totally. I mean, I think you introduced a lot of really interesting critical ideas, especially around, contextualizing your work with the history of eugenics in our discipline and our discipline being biological anthropology, but also science and medicine broadly, anthropology broadly, and thinking about these new forms of biomedical technologies like epigenetic research, genomic research that tries to, really understand and make claims about deeply political debates like intergenerational effects of partition and the lasting consequences on those who may continue to be oppressed through several different manners. What does biological information actually provide in these debates? Based on the power of quote unquote objective truth, does that place certain forms of knowledge? Does that privilege certain forms of knowledge over others? So I think there's a lot to be explored here. I'm just wondering if other people have thoughts on this. I think this is a really interesting question that we're going to be exploring throughout the rest of this series. Any final thoughts? Cool. All right, well, I'm going to leave that question open. If we will continue to do that in the next 9-8 weeks. We'll see, I should know this. But thanks so much, everyone. Please give Sanan one more round of applause. And thank you so much for your time, for the really enriching discussion. And please be in touch. Sana shared email in these slides and can quickly share their email once more in the chat. It looks like that's what's happening. There we go. And yeah, please be in touch if you have any other questions. And stay tuned. We'll be here next week, same time, same place. Cool. Thanks, y'all.
Thanks so much. And if you ever want to reach out via email or anything, please feel free. If you have questions about doing oral history or anything like that, I'm happy to talk more.
Awesome. Great. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.